expected it. I'm having this conversation this week with the CEOs. They're looking at some of their plant managers. And there are people who've risen to the occasion once they had an opportunity and some support. We never expected they'd be doing what they're doing. So as we walk through this, I want you to be thinking about some of those elements as you're trying to enable the C-suite and individuals or as a team to develop. These are some of the themes that you'll see in this. My job as an executive coach, and maybe your job as an internal HR person, an executive or top executive, when people ask you, well, what's the purpose of developing me? The simplest way I can describe it is, I want to make you self-aware and self-correcting. You need to be aware of how other people perceive you. Because if you don't know how to influence them. And self-correcting means you don't need me around to tell you what to do differently. You have some kind of standard or baseline or development plan or something that describes what better looks like that you now have incorporated with you. And as David was saying over breakfast this morning, some of my executives walk around with their development plans, and some CEOs, when they have a break, look at it and they ask themselves, how am I doing today? There's some things are blind spots for me, and if I don't pay attention to them, I can't change them. So this is the simplest example. The theme is self-aware and self-correcting. The basis of the self-correction, as I said, is there is a particular well-described description of what better behavior or good behavior looks like, and it's in what situations, with what stakeholders, in what situations. With what outcome. So they know sometimes people act very differently with different stakeholders. And I want people to focus on this is about this kind of situation so that what you get sometimes in the survey feedback are global kinds of things, and you don't know what happens. I have a COO who needs to stop poking his female general counsel. I don't know if it's the fact that he has problem with women executives. I don't know what the problem is. But at a minimum, he's got to stop poking her because he just goes after her unnecessarily. So if we got that back in a survey, we did have a survey at one point. Fortunately, it was supplemented with interviews. He saw her as an outlier, so he didn't need to pay attention to it. You do need to pay attention to it. She's part of the team. She's quite a capable woman. Here's kind of a reminder for us. You've probably seen this before. How are we going to get somebody to change? This is Beckhart's model from 1 million years ago. Or as I tell my daughters, when I went to school before there was electricity. But the important part of this model is the D stands for we need to create some dissatisfaction with the current state. It may be good, it's not good enough. When we talk about culture and resistance, David talked about it this morning, it's based on a history of success. The reason why we do things is because we think it got us to where we are today. We need to crack that somehow. And if you think about people, whether businesses are evolving or they're in a different role, what made you successful in the past may not make you successful in the future. How do we give them that data and that insight? The second piece is I need to give them the V, a vision of what better looks like. If you really were effective, what would that look like? You can get that back from 360s in terms of recommendations of what are the things you need to be doing differently. More of, less of, or doing it a different way in order to be more effective. And what happens sometimes is when you finally get an executive's attention, they'll say, okay, what you're saying is I'm here, and what I need is over here. Whew, that looks like a big step. How the hell do I get there? You need to show them the first step. You need to have some kind of plan in place. This is going to be a journey. It's not an event. This is going to be a marathon. It's not a sprint. But I can help you get started with things that you can have control over and you can see some results with. So I would encourage you, as you're thinking about different alternatives, to use this model as you're trying to influence other people. In the next hour or so, what I'd like to try and do, and feel free to ask questions along the way or make points or comments or whatever, we're trying to identify the multiple roles that you might play and what are some of the pros and the cons of those different roles in developing either individuals or the C-suite. How do you develop more professional leverage? We'll talk a little bit about that. And some ways that you don't find yourself in a situation where you're in a catch-22 and somebody's devaluing you. And then finally, are there potential problems or outcomes, there are landmines in developing the C-suite? What are the landmines you want to be able to avoid? But before we talk about that, let's talk about what's unique about C-suite teams. Some of them are similar to other teams, other executive teams, But there are some differences. So let's just talk about, when we're talking about C-suite teams, what are we really talking about in terms of some of the challenges in facing them? It's not a cookie-cutter approach. Depending on where you are in the business cycle, the challenges facing that team can definitely affect how the team is going to address the effectiveness. So down here, this is just a model. You've probably seen multiple models of the business life cycle. But in a startup situation, I've had the chance to work with people who are actually working in Apple in startup situations, and they're way down here. They're great at generating ideas. They're great at generating multiple ideas. If they go down a dead end, they go to a different place. They love cooking up new ideas. But when you start getting into rapid growth, they're not very good. They're not all that interested in selling it. They just like making up the idea. The next level, I saw this at Cisco Linksys. The husband and wife team you're familiar with Linksys? These are the home wireless networking systems that you can set up, all right? And the husband and wife team got the business to about $500 million and couldn't grow it anymore. And so John Chambers hired Joe Kopak, who hired me to help him. He's ex-GE, ex-Compaq. He wanted some help to figure out how he changed the organization. And what we discovered was when you have a high growth situation, like they had, they basically said in their business strategy, we're going to focus on the United States and Europe. We'll get to China and Asia later on. We're certainly not going to go to Africa, and South America's a mess. And so what would happen? The phone would ring. Somebody in South America, in Venezuela, would say, we think we want to buy 200 units. 6 people will get on an airplane and fly to Venezuela. What's lacking? Discipline. Strategy is about doing things you can do and not doing things you can do. It's about being selective about where your sweet spot is. So they hired Mike to come in, and his challenge with that team was to implement disciplined growth, which meant not all revenue is good revenue. Revenue we can make margins off of is good revenue. So you can just use those as examples, is that each one of these different stages are different challenges for teams. So that's the first question is, what is the team challenged with from a business perspective? Like it or not, here are some of the common characteristics of C-suite teams. Everybody at the table has an agenda. Can't make it go away, including HR. HR wants to take the organization someplace, finance wants to, et cetera, et cetera. The interesting thing is sometimes the CEO will minimize this, and you'll say, well, we're going to change somebody out or we're going to add somebody to the team. Changing one member changes the whole dynamics in the team. Sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's not subtle at all. Power relationships change, subject matter experts change. So this is another consideration as people start thinking about how do I develop the team and who should be on the team. Often there are sort of highlighted, visible factions around certain kinds of issues, and we can say, you know, there's kind of 3 people who tend to be on this side of the table and 3 people that tend to be on this side of the table. But it's not on all the issues. What's interesting is if you watch subtly, when the issues change, the alliances and the factions change. So high-performing teams know that there's always going to be some kind of politics involved. They just deal with it in a very constructive way. They deal with it in a very constructive way. So when people complain about factions, it's not about the fact that we have factions. It's the fact that we need to know how to manage those factions and what the issues are that they organize themselves around. Some bad behavior is always tolerated. Somebody asked me a long time ago, they said, what's the definition of a dysfunctional family? I said, it's 2 people sitting in a room who happen to be related to each other. There's always something not quite right on the team that when you take a look. And so part of what we have to do is put up with people's foibles, but then it becomes a matter of degree. In some situations, people just put up with really bad behavior because people get business results or they have major influential relationships outside of the organization. Now the challenge with that, by the way, I see a lot of you writing, you can get copies of this updated piece, and then also I think we're going to offer you the video either through this organization or I'm going to be editing my own as well, so feel free to contact us. So don't feel a need to take copious notes just to capture what's on the slides. But I've seen organizations, and we'll talk about this down on number 6, I have seen people keep organizations hostage. You don't understand, I am indispensable. If you do this to me and I leave the organization, I'm taking these accounts with me, these relationships with me, et cetera, et cetera. And my advice after I help the executives assess that typically is develop plan B and then call their bluff. because after 25, almost 30 years of doing this, it's almost, I can't think of an exception where somebody left and you know what? The business went on and it actually was better because there was somebody in that role who was not as disruptive. Number 5 is probably the most difficult problem I see senior executive teams deal with. I label it the tweeners. Gary's worked for us for 12 years. He's come to work every day and he's done everything we've asked him to do. He's a great guy. But this role is so critical to our implementing and executing our strategy. We need a world-class player. We need somebody who can run 40 yards in 4 seconds. Gary's never going to run a 40 yards in 40 seconds. He's good. Is he good enough? People agonize over that. And at some point you have to bite the bullet and say, let's find a good place for Gary to land. Let's give him some assignment that plays off of his strengths. If we can't find one, we may have to ultimately offer him to industry. But the performance of the business is so important, we have to high grade that particular role. Let's go get somebody who plays at that level. I have client after client in mid-sized companies who see that when they have somebody who's been around, they're really loyal to them, and they let the loyalty get in the way of a hard look at the performance, and they don't make the changes that they need to make. I never know walking into a relationship, and you probably experienced this yourself, I never know walking in whether somebody's going to be coachable or not. I'm often disappointed by the people who seem to have the most potential, and I'm delighted by the people who somehow pull themselves together and rise to another level. But at the end of the day, there are some people who are just uncoachable. And if we try and develop them and they go nowhere, the question is, what do we do with them? The CEO, I spend a lot of time with CEOs, and this can be a very important role for you. And this is where your credibility can come in. So I spend a lot of time, most executives focus on 3 or 4 personal characteristics or competencies. And then they paint the person with the rest of the brush, either positively or negatively. They either assume that if they've got these 3 things, they got a lot of other good things. Or they think they've got these 2 or 3 foibles, and therefore they're not worth very much. The biggest challenge, nobody's perfect in any of these jobs. And as you know, as HR people, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, you build organizations sometimes around collections of individuals based on their strengths and weaknesses. If it was a perfect world, you might build it a little bit differently. But in this case, you always have CEOs who have favorites and suspects, and the best thing I can do is try and get them to have a balanced view. So, yes, Gary does have these 2 or 3 characteristics. Don't forget he also does these things really well. Or, don't forget the CFO is really good at finance. Oh, by the way, he leaves so much collateral damage behind him as people are leaving and hitting the silk as fast as they possibly can. These are the kinds of things that you have in a role that... conflict avoidance with senior people, I was just laughing in the hallway with somebody who heard the last discussion. It goes right up to the president and CEO level. Why don't you go talk to so-and-so and just tell them? And they actually will do things like hire other people so that they don't have to go to somebody and tell them they're limited and stop this, cut this out. They'll actually avoid those kinds of conversations. So for you to be able to have a conversation with somebody and say, yeah, they get good business results. This is why GE went to the point of focusing on, and I know there's somebody in the room from GE. I heard this from a number of people, including Mike Pocock, who is ex-GE. He said, we got so focused on results, it was how you got there anyway. It didn't really matter. So then we had to plug in the other side, which is you have to get both results, and you have to get there a certain way. You can't get there just anyway. And so part of this is, yeah, Gary's great at getting results, but there's so much collateral damage in the organization. The climate's lousy, the culture stinks, and people are leaving in droves. And the team has no process for evaluating its development. Nobody ever has a discussion about where are we going? How are we going to get better? Why shouldn't this team have continuous improvement just like the rest of the organization? That's kind of 10 as well. The team members really have no idea. If they were better, what would it look like? I have a couple of clients where they've actually gone, people have had an opportunity to sit in at a senior executive team that is high performing, and they come back and they go, you can't imagine what those conversations are like. They're focused, they're crisp, they disagree with each other, they don't take it personally, and they walk out with a resolution, and everybody knows what the decision is. Why can't we do that? Number 11, remember the book a few years ago, I'm okay, you're okay? Here's one of the challenges. I'm okay. Everybody else needs development. We often get this with the CEO. I'll tell you a story in a little bit about the fact that I actually got that from the HR executive. Fix them. I'm fine. Thank you very much. And let's have this is my favorite. Let's have a development event. Well, labor development, if we call it development, it must be development. We get our ticket punched and we move on. So we go to Aspen, we go to Center for Creative Leadership, we go someplace else. And I don't mean to pick on Center for Creative Leadership, but they have no coaching network. They have a very limited coaching network. So when people come back after having gone through a week and getting 360 feedback and putting together a development plan, I mean, I get calls often saying they've been to CCL, they're back on the job, they don't know what to do next, and there's no follow-up. So we have an event. I mean, it's a nice event. It's like going to listen to an inspirational speaker. Everybody gets all revved up, and you could say, okay, when you go back to the office on Monday morning, what's going to be different? I don't know.